Thank you very much for coming. It's been a wonderful evening.
Yes.
Apologies perhaps to Muslims in the audience who say God is great all the time. We'll circle back.
Okay.
Chris Hedges, to you, answer my daughter's question. Maybe you'll warn her off.
If you don't mind, it would be Christopher and Hitchens.
Yes, sir.
Chris Hedges is a horrible...
Hedges, did I say
yes,
Hedges?
you did.
Forgive me.
Chris Hedges is a horrible apologist for liberation.
Christopher Hitchens.
That's better.
Too many guests, too little time.
Sorry, but I exist too, if you see what I mean.
Yes, yes.
May as well start by establishing that ontological claim. Well, Friedrich Nietzsche famously said that God was dead, and Sigmund Freud can be rendered as having said that God was dad. And I think both of them are probably right. The concept of God is like everything else in our vocabulary, man-made. It's an invention of human beings. Unless you take the view that God made us, in which case it'd be a lot to explain. Why did we in that case make so many gods? It does seem to be very much more probable that men and women made many gods than that any one God made all men and women and the rest of creation. And as well as being man-made, it's fear-made. It is the unexpressed or partially expressed wish for a protector, a parent, someone who will never desert you, someone who will do in a way you're thinking for you, especially on questions of moral philosophy. At its best, it's that. It's a wish to be loved more than you probably deserve. And at its worst, it's the underdeveloped part of the human psyche that leads to totalitarianism, that wants to worship and that wants a boss, that wants a celestial dictatorship. And that's the bit that's now threatening to destroy our secular civilization. And so you're quite right to start where you do. It used to be believed, I mean, the number of gods now it's infinite, and a new god is created almost every day by some cult or other, but it used to be that. There was a belief that gods were in the trees, in the woods, in the springs, in the sea, in the clouds, and so forth. Polytheism of a kind. Then something a bit more polytheistic, like Olympus, where there was at least a location for the divine, but it was multifaceted. And then monotheism, getting it down to one. So I regard this as progress of a sort, because they're getting nearer the true figure all the time.
Christopher, are you a trickster?
Well, I don't think that, you couldn't accuse that of being an incorrect statement. You could accuse it of being an incomplete one. I didn't give all the reasons why people believe in God, but after all, you did write a whole book that argues that the belief in God can be very useful to people in times of crisis. Did you not? I mean, that's... and that's
yes, but I never said that was why you should believe in God.
No, and I don't think it is the reason why many people do. But remember that there are two questions. Well, I better now say, lest I be accused of not having exhausted the entire subject in my first response, I better say there are at least two questions. One is this: is there a God? A creator, a prime mover, an uncaused cause, whatever you like to call it. And this was the question answered at a certain point, not very long ago in our history, by the deists, people like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and many others, who said that the order of the universe seemed to suggest that it couldn't just have been random, that there may have been a designer, but the designer didn't take any part in human affairs. And that, in the late 17th, early 18th centuries was probably, late 18th, early 19th centuries was probably a very intelligent position to hold. It was as far, pre-Einstein, pre-Darwin, was probably as far as you were likely to get with philosophical speculation. But so believing that there might be a cause or a mover or a creator is one thing, but believing that there is a supervising, intervening entity who cares who wins the war, who cares who you sleep with and in what way, who cares what you eat and on what day, and in other words, who makes you the center of the whole cosmos, is another thing altogether. So people who say, I believe in God, I'm a deist, have all their work in front of them before they can say that they are really religious.
Are you prepared to be a deist?
No.
No divine mover, even at the, whatever, the origin?
There's nothing in the natural, in the cosmic order, or that's the macro level, or the micro level, that's to say the constituent of our own DNA and the things that we have in common with the other animals, and indeed other forms of life like plants, that isn't susceptible to a much better explanation.
Well, here's...
You know, as the great physicist Laplace said when when he demonstrated his working model, his orrery, as it's called, of the solar system to the emperor. And Napoleon said, well, I see there's no God in this system. And Laplace said, well, Your Majesty, it works without that assumption. I can't paraphrase him properly, but you really ought to get hold of, it's easy to find on Google, a lecture given by Lawrence Krauss, I regard as the greatest living physicist. And it's about the quantum, and it's about a whole universe from nothing. It's exactly how you get from nothing to something. In fact, quite a lot of things. One means by which this happens is the following. Every second that we're speaking, a star the size of our sun or bigger goes out, blows up or goes out. That's been the case every single second since the first moment of the Big Bang. It's a lot. But that'll be a lot of suns going out as we speak. And there's a lot of annihilation, isn't it? There's a lot of destruction. It's a rather what you might call almost a wasteful scale. It does have the positive outcome, though, that we are all constituted of those materials. We are made of stardust. Now, I find that a rather more majestic and wonderful and even beautiful idea than, say, the idea of the burning bush. A bit more impressive. Gives you more to think about.
Are they mutually exclusive? Are they mutually exclusive? Wouldn't God make you of stardust?
One has the virtue of being true and provable and studyable, which the other doesn't. And I do think that the verifiability of something is a virtue of
Are we simply material then?
Yes. We don't have bodies, we are bodies. Until 50,000 years ago, there were 4 other kinds of biped, humanoid, not unlike us, still living on the planet, died leaving no descendants. We're the only survivors of those people. That family were the last. We don't know if they had gods or not.
So you think the inexplicable...
No religion ever invented appears to have known that these creatures even existed, because the religious are forced to believe that the only really significant event that happened in the human story happened about 3,000 years ago.
And the mysteries, the inexplicable, are we just waiting?
That's not true.
No,
it's factually
all of this massive Big Bang cosmological churning and destruction and annihilation, which is paralleled, by the way, on our own Earth, where 99% of all species that have ever been on the planet have already gone extinct, leaving no descendants. All of this could be part of a plan. There is no way an atheist can prove it's not. But it's some plan, isn't it, with mass destruction, pitiless extermination, annihilation going on all the time, and all of this set in motion on a scale that's absolutely beyond our imagination, in order that the Pope can tell people not to jerk off.
I don't understand how you get free will if you don't have God.
Christopher.
It's pathetic, I'm sorry to say, it's to say of the cosmological and the genetic that these are deterministic processes. They're not at all. They're full of extraordinary randomness, and in the genetic case of mutation. Stephen Jay Gould, the great paleontologist, wrote a book which I recommend to you called The Burgess Shale, which is it's the side of a mountain in Canada, in the Canadian Rockies, that's sheared off. So you can see the inside of a mountain. You can see it as if you're looking at a blackboard, and you can see the growth and development of species, and you realize that it's not a tree, it's more like a bush. There are reverse branches that go off and don't go nowhere, and there are others that succeed. And different kinds of failure and different kinds of mutation. His most exciting thought, most revolutionary thought, is this. If you could, so to speak, put all that onto a tape and rewind it, and then press play again, there's no certainty it would come out the same way. In fact, there's every reason to believe that it would not. So there's nothing predetermined, there's nothing deterministic about this at all. And thanks to your understanding of our genetics, which are also not predetermined because they're a result of random mutation and natural selection, as everyone now knows, and that's why we can have, sad to say for the kosher, but we can have skin transplants and organ transplants from pigs who are much closer to us than we used to think. We can also sequence the DNA of viruses and learn how to immunize ourselves from them. It works, in other words. But yes, it can be tampered with, it can be engineered, for good as well as for ill. There's nothing deterministic about it at all. It's much more exciting, it's much more interesting, it's much more rewarding, it's verifiable, and yes, there are elements of, I was trying to say, the miraculous, the awe-inspiring, the tragic, the majestic in this, that there simply are not in the incantations of Genesis, where the supposed authors claim to know the divinity, the creator, on personal terms. This is nonsense. It's for children.
Rabbi?
Well, thank you, Georgetown. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Thank you, Michael, for that suspiciously terse introduction, which of all the introductions I've heard to myself is certainly the most recent. Thank you seriously to the Ethics and Public Policy Center for your work, for conceiving this idea, for encouraging me to do it, for bringing us Dr. McGrath all the way from our common alma mater of Oxford, and for the regular seminars that you may not know that Michael does all the time on these matters of faith versus reason, which is after all the ground on which we're met this evening. I always come before events like this with antagonists like Dr. McGrath with a slight sense, a very slight sense, hope it doesn't sound self-pitying, of inequality. My views are, if I say it for myself, tolerably well advertised. And if they're not, it's partly your fault. Because what I say is fairly intelligible, very plainly stated. You know what I think if you care to find out. When I debate with Jews and Muslims and Christians, I very often find, I say, well, do you really believe there was a virgin birth? Do you really believe in a Genesis creation? Do you really believe in bodily resurrection? And I get a sort of Monty Python reply. Well, this is a little bit metaphorical, really. I'm not sure, and I'm going to find out, I'm determined to find out this evening, which line on this my antagonist does take. And I want you to notice, and I want you to test him on it. Because I think it's fair. And I'm going to talk to him and to you as if he did represent the Christian faith. I can't do all three monotheisms tonight. I may get a whack at the other two in the course of the discussion. I can only really do his. And I'm going to assume that it means something to him and that it's not just a humanist metaphysics. And I think I'm entitled to that assumption. The main thing I want to dispute this evening, because I'm either drowning in time with 20 minutes, it's either too much or too little, is this. You hear it very often said by people of a vague faith that, well, it may not be the case that religion is metaphysically true. Its figures and its stories may be legendary or dwell on the edge of myth, prehistoric. Its truth claims may be laughable. We have better explanations for the origins both of our cosmos and our species now, so much better so, in fact, that had they been available to begin with, religion would never have taken root. No one would now go back to the stage when we didn't have any real philosophy. We only had mythology. When we thought we lived on a flat planet, or when we thought that our planet was circulated by the sun instead of the other way around, when we didn't know there were microorganisms as part of creation and that they were more powerful than us and had dominion over us rather than we them, when we were fearful, the infancy of our species, we wouldn't have taken up theism if we'd known now what we did then. But allow for all that. You still have to credit religion with being the source of ethics and morals. Where would we get these from if it weren't for faith? I think if, in the time I've got, I think that's the position I most want to undermine. I further think that it undermines us in our most essential integrity. It dissolves our obligation to live and witness in truth. Which of us would say that we would believe something because it might cheer us up, or tell our children that something was true because it might dry their eyes? Which of us indulges in wishful thinking, who really cares about the pursuit of truth at all costs and at all hazards? Can it not be said, do you not in fact hear it said repeatedly about religion and by the religious themselves that, well, it may not be really true, the stories may be fairy tales, the history may be dubious, but it provides consolation? Can anyone hear themselves saying this or have it said of them without some kind of embarrassment, without the concession that thinking here is directly wishful, that yes, it would be nice if you could throw your sins and your responsibilities on someone else and have them dissolved, but it's not true and it's not morally sound. Well, am I audible? Am I audible to all? Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades, friends, thanks for coming out, as Senator Larry Craig actually did say at his press conference. Thank you, Mr. Hewitt and Dr. Craig, for being among the very many Christians who have so generously and hospitably and warmly taken me up on the challenge I issued when I started my little book tour and welcomed me to your places to have this most important of all discussions. I can't express my gratitude enough. And thanks to the very nice young ladies who I ran into at the Elephant Bar this afternoon, where I hadn't expected a posse of Biola students to be on staff, but where I thought, God, they're everywhere now. Now, what I have discovered in voyaging around this country and others in this debate, and just debating with Hindus, with Muslims, with the Jews, with Christians of all stripes, is that the arguments are all essentially the same for belief in the supernatural, for belief in faith, for belief in God, but that there are very interesting and noteworthy discrepancies between them. And one that I want to call attention to at the beginning of this evening is between those like my friend Doug Wilson, with whom I've now done a book of argument about Christian apologetics, who would call himself a presuppositionalist, in other words, for whom really it's only necessary to discover the workings of God's will in the cosmos, and to assume that the truth of Christianity is already proven, and what are called, and they include Dr. Craig with great honor and respect in this, the evidentialists. Now, I want to begin by saying that this distinction strikes me first as a very charming distinction, and second as false, or perhaps as a distinction without a difference. Well, why do I say charming? Because I think it's rather sweet that people of faith also think they ought to have some evidence. And I think it's progress of a kind. After all, if we had been having this debate in the mid-19th century, Professor Craig or his equivalent would have known little or probably nothing about the laws of physics and biology. Maybe even less than I know now, which is to say quite a lot in its way. And they would have grounded themselves, or he would have grounded himself, on faith, on Scripture, on revelation, on the prospect of salvation, on the means of grace, and the hope of glory, and perhaps on Paley's natural theology. Paley, who had the same rooms, or had the same rooms later occupied by Charles Darwin in Cambridge, with its watchmaker theory of design that I know I don't have to expound to you, but which briefly suggests that if an Aborigine is walking along a beach and finds a gold watch ticking, he knows not what it's for, or where it came from, or who made it, but he knows it's not a rock, he knows it's not a vegetable, he knows it must have had a designer. The Paley analogy held for most Christians for many years, because they were willing to make the assumption that we were mechanisms, and that therefore there must be a watchmaker. But now that it's been, here's where the presuppositionalist versus evidentialist dichotomy begins to kick in. Now it's been rather painstakingly and elaborately demonstrated, to the satisfaction of most people, I don't want to just use arguments from authority, but it's not very much contested anymore, that we are not designed as creatures, but that we evolved by a rather laborious combination of random mutation and natural selection into the species that we are today. It is, of course, open to the faithful to say that all this was, now that they come to know it, now that it becomes available to everybody, now that they think about it, and now that they've stopped opposing it or trying to ban it, then they can say, actually, on second thought, the evolution was all part of the design. Well, as you will recognize, ladies and gentlemen, there are some arguments I can't be expected to refute or rebut, because there's no way around that argument. I mean, if everything, including evolution, which isn't a design, is nonetheless part of a divine design, then all the advantage goes to the person who's willing to believe that. That cannot be disproved. But it does seem to me a very poor and very weak argument, because the test of a good argument is that it is falsifiable, not that it's unfalsifiable. So this I would therefore, this tactic or this style of argument, which we've had some evidence of this evening, I would rebaptize, or might I dare say I would rechristen it, as retrospective evidentialism. In other words, everything can, in due time, if you have enough faith, be made to fit. And you too are all quite free to believe that a sentient creator deliberately, consciously put himself, a being, put himself or herself or itself to the trouble of going through huge epochs of birth and death of species over eons of time, in which 99%, in the course of which at least 99.9% of all species, all life forms ever to have appeared on Earth have become extinct, as we nearly did as a species ourselves. I invite you to look up the very alarming and beautiful and brilliant account by the National Geographic's coordinator of the Genome Project. By the way, you should send in your little sample from the inside of your cheek and have your African ancestry traced. It's absolutely fascinating to follow the mitochondrial DNA that we all have in common and that we have in common with other species, other primates and other life forms, and find out where in Africa you came from. But there came a time, probably about 180,000 years ago, when, due to a terrible climatic event, probably in Indonesia, an appalling global warming crisis occurred. And the estimate is that the number of humans in Africa went down to between 40 and 30,000. This close, think about fine-tuning, this close to joining every other species that had gone extinct. And that's our Exodus story, is that somehow, we don't know how, because it's not written in any scripture, it's not told in any book, it's not part of any superstitious narrative, but somehow the escape from Africa to cooler latitudes was made. But that's how close it was. You have to be able to imagine that all this mass extinction and death and randomness is the will of a being. You are absolutely free to believe that if you wish. And all of this should happen so that one very imperfect race of evolved primates should have the opportunity to become Christians or to turn up at this gym tonight. That all of that was done with us in view. It's a curious kind of solipsism. It's a curious kind of self-centeredness. I was always brought up to believe that Christians were modest and humble and comported themselves with due humility. And there's a certain arrogance to this assumption that all of this extraordinary development was all about us. And we were the intended and designed result, and everything else was in the discard. The tremendous wastefulness of it, the tremendous cruelty of it, the tremendous caprice of it, the tremendous tinkering and incompetence of it, never mind. At least we're here, and we can be people of faith. It doesn't work for me, I have to simply say that, and I think there may be questions of psychology involved in this as well. Believe it if you can. I can't stop you. Believe it if you like. You're welcome. It's obviously impossible, as I said before, to disprove, and it equally obviously helps you to believe it if, as we all are, you're in the happy position of knowing the outcome. In other words, we are here, but there's a fallacy lurking in there somewhere too. Is there not? Now, it's often said, it was said tonight, and Dr. Craig said it in print, that atheists think they can prove the non-existence of God. This, in fact, very slightly but crucially misrepresents what we've always said. And there's nothing new about the new atheists, it's just we're recent. There's nothing particularly new. Dr. Victor Stenger, a great scientist, has written a book called The Failed Hypothesis, which he says he thinks that science can now license the claim that there definitely is no God, but he's unique in that and I think very bold and courageous. Here's what we argue. We argue quite simply that there's no plausible or convincing reason, certainly no evidential one, to believe that there is such an entity, and that all observable phenomena, including the cosmological one to which I'm coming, are explicable without the hypothesis. You don't need the assumption. And this objection itself, our school, falls into at least two, perhaps three sections. There's no such thing, no such word, though there should be, as adeism, or as being an adeist, but if there was one, I would say that's what I was. I don't believe that we are here as the result of a design, or that by making the appropriate propitiations and adopting the appropriate postures and following the appropriate rituals, we can overcome death. I don't believe that, and for a priori reasons, don't. If there was such a force, which I cannot prove by definition that there was not, if there was an entity that was responsible for the beginning of the cosmos, and that also happened to be busily engineering the very laborious production of life on our little planet, it still wouldn't prove that this entity cared about us, answered prayers, cared what church we went to, or whether we went to one at all, cared who we had sex with, or in what position, or by what means, cared what we ate or on what day, cared whether we lived or died. There's no reason at all why this entity isn't completely indifferent to us. That you cannot get from deism to theism except by a series of extraordinarily generous to yourself assumptions. The deist has all his work still ahead of him to show that it leads to revelation, to redemption, to salvation, or to suspensions of the natural order, in which hitherto you've been putting all your faith, all your evidence is on scientific and natural evidence, or why not, for a change of pace and a change of taste, say yes, but sometimes this same natural order, which is so miraculous in observation, no question about it, is so impressive in its favouring the conditions for life in some ways, but it's randomly suspended when miracles are required. So with caprice and contempt, these laws turn out not to be so important after all, as long as the truth of religion can be proved by their being rendered inoperative. This is having it both ways in the most promiscuous and exorbitant manner in my submission. Bear in mind also that these are not precisely the differences between Dr. Craig and myself, I mean, morally or intellectually equivalent claims. After all, Dr. Craig, to win this argument, has to believe and prove to a certainty. He's not just saying there might be a God, because he has to say there must be one, otherwise we couldn't be here and there couldn't be morality. It's not a contingency for him. I have to say that I appear as a skeptic who believes that doubt is the great engine, the great fuel of all inquiry, all discovery, and all innovation, and that I doubt these things. The disadvantage, it seems to me, in the argument goes to the person who says, no, I know it, it must be true, it is true. We're too early in the study of physics and biology, it seems to me, to be dealing in certainties of that kind, especially when the stakes are so high. It seems to me, to put it in a condensed form, extraordinary claims, such as the existence of a divine power with a son who cares enough to come and redeem us, extraordinary claims require truly extraordinary evidence. I don't think any of the evidence we heard from Dr. Craig, brilliantly marshalled as it was extraordinary enough to justify the extreme claims that are being made and backed by it.
I have to be brief, so I'll be terse. Like a number of people who are students of religion, I've spent a lot of time lately, as you should if you have the opportunity, I recommend it very highly, with Professor Dermot McCulloch's History of Christianity. Marvelous work of scholarship and literature, written by a mainstream believer, extraordinarily broad and deep, in which he ponders one very important question, the only one I've got time for now. What happened to the word Christendom? Remember, there used to be such a term. It used to extend across the world, and the hope is that it would extend even further. And it was unironically used to mean those areas of human civilization, and areas yet to be civilized, of course, where the word of Jesus Christ reigned or would reign. And it's all gone. The word is never used except historically or sarcastically now. And McCulloch doesn't say it ended because of the Crusades, though he could. It didn't. Crusades didn't kill it. Not because of slavery, mandated by Christianity. That didn't kill it either. Nor the mass murder of colonial subjects in the yet-to-be Christianized world. That wasn't sufficient. It didn't really end, he said, till 1914, when all the Christian empires of the world, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Britain, France is a slight exception to this, but only a slight one, and Russia, all of them commanded by Christian emperors, and calling upon their subjects as Christians, went to war with each other and very nearly destroyed the whole human civilization, and certainly reduced it to a point where we can't guess where we might be if it hadn't been for this extraordinary outbreak of barbarism. And out of that came the terrors of fascism and of Stalinism, of which it was the seedbed as well. I mention this partly because I want to maintain that there's no such thing as a religion of peace by definition. And second, to point out, and that its best historian has to admit something that if I was a Christian would make me humiliated. But because there was another empire involved in that war, the Ottoman Empire, which also came to an end, its other name was the Caliphate, the Muslim Caliphate. It went to war on the side of German and Austrian imperialism and Hungarian imperialism, and it lost not just the war, having proclaimed a worldwide jihad against Christianity, except for German and Austrian and Hungarian Christianity, which were its allies. And it didn't just lose the war, but by 1924 had been dissolved by the Turkish leadership, by Ataturk. It lost the Caliphate. And that's the only one that still has supporters. The other Christian and religious empires have all gone. But the Caliphate still has fans, not just in the Muslim world, sometimes referred to by Muslims as the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, but also in what some Muslims call the Dar al-Harb, the House of War, the part of the world that isn't yet Muslim. There are Caliphate clubs in London now and Berlin and elsewhere, quite important ones. And what I want to know is why that is and what we should think about it. Believers in this fantasy have, Laurie's spared me the need to say much of this, have committed extraordinary atrocities in Istanbul, in Madrid, in India, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and of course in our own fair city. And the pretexts for it vary. They can be, the excuse for the mass murder can be that Australia has helped East Timor become independent from Indonesia. They can be that Newsweek has printed a false story about the desecration of a supposedly holy book. You never know what it's going to be next. But everyone knows to be careful about it, and everyone understands that the threat of violence that backs it is believable. And that's my opening position. Now you will say, I can hear it already being said, you may be saying it already to yourselves because the defense mechanisms kick in. And in any case, Laurie already said it for you. And I hope Professor Ramadan won't feel the need to say it again, but if he does, fair enough. You may say, that's not the real Islam. Those aren't real Muslims. Now, isn't that a fascinating objection? Is there anyone in this room, I exempt Professor Ramadan because it's his turn to speak next, is there anyone in this room who would care to arbitrate that question? Who is to say, where is the authority that defines who is a true son of the prophet or true interpreter of his work? Part of the problem to begin with, and it's part of the problem because it is a religion, is that it's perfectly true to say we don't know who the true Muslims are. How right that is, who does speak for it. Only the second problem with defining Islam as peaceful, only the second problem with defining it as peaceful has to do with the fact that it's highly fissile and highly schismatic, that there is a civil war going on within it, the religion of peace. As we speak, at least one civil war between the votaries of this religion of peace is already taking place, and some of it is exported outside that world into ours, very salient fact. The first reason, though, is this. Islam makes very large claims for itself, very large claims indeed. It claims to be the last and final religion, the last and final revelation. When you see bumper stickers, everyone says you can't reduce major things to a bumper sticker. It's not my idea to have bumper stickers saying Islam is the solution. It's a well-known slogan actually of parties associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They say Islam is the solution for everything. It takes care of all your life and the one to come. Sexuality, political economy, banking, diet, relations with other religions, everything. It's a total solution. What is creepy about the word total? I hope I don't have to tell an audience like this. It's the first 5 letters of the word totalitarian. It's absolute. It's absolute. It's all-inclusive. It's unanswerable. And oddly, for a religion that makes such large claims, notice another thing about Islam, it doesn't particularly like having these claims questioned or scrutinized. In other words, just as there is with all religions an inverse relationship between the claims they make and the evidence they can produce for them, you must have noticed that, with Islam, a younger religion, and perhaps therefore more in its first flush, There's an extraordinarily strong willingness to say that any challenge to its absolutist claims is by definition profane. And profanity and blasphemy can be the antecedent to very severe punishment, and often are, for Muslims and for non-Muslims. And this is not a road of peace in my submission. Thus my first point completed. The claim to govern everything from hygiene to sex and the afterlife, which contains detailed prescriptions for the good and bad versions of itself, again strikes me as somewhat totalitarian, and they're both based upon two very, very questionable and not very peaceful concepts. One is the idea of a perfect human being, the Prophet Muhammad, and the other is the idea of a perfect book, the Quran, the recitation. Now, the category perfect human primate or mammal, and the category flawless book that could possibly not use any kind of change, revision, or editing, are categories that do not exist. There are no members of these categories. Therefore, any challenge to this faith is bound to lead to heresy and to schism, and does. And just as all forms of absolutism and totalitarianism, leader worship and revealed truth, unalterable text, always do, because they can break, perhaps, but they cannot bend. And thus the latent potential of violence between them, among them, as well as within them, is very great. And at any moment, someone is in danger of being accused of being an apostate or an unbeliever. This week, the Coptic Pope of Egypt, Pope Shenouda, who represents 10 million Egyptians, was hustled onto Egyptian TV. He's not asked on all that often. I don't think he was even asked on this time. I think he was told he'd better come on. Why is the leader of Egypt's huge Christian minority suddenly compelled to make a TV appearance? Because one of his bishops had said in an interview that he thought that some of the verses of the Quran showed signs of having been added later on, and to have been later accretion. And Pope Shenouda was forced onto the television to say, it's not that that didn't happen, it's it couldn't have happened. It shouldn't even be discussed. So that it has to be claimed even by non-Muslim subjects of a Muslim state that there is, after all, because no Christian claims this about the Bible anymore, no Jew claims it about the Pentateuch, after all, yes, there is just one book that's completely word and letter perfect, from the first time it was not even written down, but recited. Now, demands that you believe the impossible do not lead to peaceful outcomes. Nor do they lead to peaceful or tolerant regimes. And I'm not going to ask you which Muslim country you would like to live in. I don't know whether Professor Ramana will tell us which one he would pick if he had to, because I don't have to ask you a question like that, because it's already in your mind.
Can you wind up now?
Yes, I can. I can, yes, and will. Shall, in fact. Sexual repression doesn't lead to peace. The idea that women are inferior to men is a profound cause of unease, let's say the least of it. All religions make some form of this claim. Islam seems to make it less apologetically than most. Claims that the world will come to an end in an apocalyptic form, which will lead to the victory of one religion or another, are not peaceful either. It's possible, perhaps, I haven't exhausted all my remarks, that the endless teaching of battle stories to children and the stories of lethal feuds from 7th century Arabia don't lead to peace, or the forcing of children to memorize and retell such stories by rote doesn't lead to peace either. It's arguable that peace isn't attainable at all. It may be arguable in some forms, that sometimes in places that religion isn't even desirable, but it will not come by the fanatical adoption of a man-made text and a man-made supreme leader. Nothing but war and tyranny has ever come from the adoption of formulae like these. The only way to moral and intellectual satisfaction, even temporary, perhaps only temporary, but of any kind at all,
comes to those who are willing to take the great risk of thinking for themselves at all hazards and trying to share the benefits of that tolerance and that open-mindedness with others. And with that, for now, I'll rest my case. Thank you very much.